So today a text by Alain Badiou, which is titled Number and Numbers and is translated by Robin McKay. It's a very important text, and people who are interested in Alain Badiou's thought, I would recommend that they should begin with this text, Number and Numbers, instead of being an event or other writings of Badiou, because it is in this text that his philosophical and political program is articulated with great clarity. So this could actually serve as an introduction to Alain Badiou's thought, and for me, it was a useful text while I was working on mathematics, for a sociology of mathematics. So I have benefited from this text. So it's a very important text, and what I'll be speaking about from the text are two chapters today. One is the chapter numbered 0, and the title of the chapter is Number Must Be Thought, and the other is chapter numbered 1, which is titled Genealogies, Frege, Dedekind, Piano and Cantor. So these are the two chapters that I'll be speaking about today. So let's start right away with the first chapter, which is numbered 0, and it will emerge in our discussion, if not in this if not today, then maybe in discussions which will follow after this, that why is this chapter numbered 0. This is a very important philosophical step and a mathematical step to number it at 0. It will emerge as we go along. So the chapter is titled Number Must Be Thought. Now, what is the problem with which Alain Badiou is beginning with this book? The basic problem that Alain Badiou is trying to raise is that although we live in an era where we are surrounded by numbers, numbers are everywhere. Numbers act as measure for whatever we do, for whatever opinions we have, for our understanding of democracy, for our understanding of politics, for our understanding of economy. It is framed in terms of numbers. We respond, we understand each other in terms of numbers. Opinions are formed in terms of numbers. Citizenship, rules of citizenship, data related to citizenship, all is based upon numbers. And yet Alain Badiou says that we have very little understanding of what number is. So even though we are surrounded by numbers, even though we are ruled by numbers, our lives are ordered by numbers, we count ourselves through numbers. So to exist is to count oneself and be counted by the state. Still, we do not know what the count amounts to or what a number is. And he says that precisely because of this, precisely because the very idea of number is outside, so to speak, the purview of thought in contemporary times. Thought doesn't extend itself to think what a number is. Precisely because of that, we are ruled by numbers. Our lives are controlled by numbers. Our lives are manipulated by numbers and statistics and so on. So, and he thinks that this is these numbers are numbers not in a mathematical sense, but numbers in the statistical sense. So there is a proliferation of numbers, endlessness of numbers. Numbers are everywhere. And what is the precise mathematical stake or the precise philosophical stake as far as the idea of number is concerned, we are absolutely unsure about it. And Badiou thinks that this is a problem. This is a problem particularly considering the fact that in the early 20th century, thinking the number was a very important philosophical and mathematical project. So from that era where thinking the number was important, articulating the number, philosophically philosophizing about number was a very important aspect of thought. We have come to the times where, although we have numbers all around, we don't think, we don't understand what a number is. So this is what he is doing in the first chapter. He's trying to raise this problem. So he says that we do not have, the first sentence of the book says that we have at our disposal no recent active idea of what number is. So even though there are numbers all around, we don't know, we don't have a dynamic, active idea of what number is. He says this is the case even though you consider all spheres of our lives. Consider, say for example, politics, and he says if you look at politics, we are surrounded by numbers. There are opinions, there are democracies, there are census, polls of all kinds, surrounded by numbers, surrounded by enumeration, incessant enumeration. Yet there is absolutely no understanding. And this is true of not only politics, but also about academic sciences as well, human sciences or quasi-human sciences like political science and sociology and so on. So we think the idea of a community on the basis of a number. We think the idea of history, for example, on the basis of diachrony, again based on the sense of number. We think medicine on the basis of the idea of number. And he says that there is an absolute saturation. All fields are saturated with numbers. Our legitimacy, what we say, will count only if we frame it in terms of numbers. And yet he says that there is absolutely no thought, absolutely no effort on the part of philosophy, on the part of thought, to think what number is. So it's on page number 3 that he says, and I quote, "Number informs our souls. What is it to exist if not to give a favorable account of oneself?" End quote. And he says that such a situation prevails that we are forced in order to legitimize our existence. We can only legitimize our existence on the basis of numbers. Lives become illegitimate. Lives become illegal. People become illegal if they are not counted. So Badiou says that this is the truth of our times, that we are manipulated by this idea of number, this presence of number, this incessant unfolding of number in every field, and yet we do not have a thought of number. And he thinks that this is a very important problem. As we go along with the text, this will emerge that why is this an important problem. But Badiou presents this to begin with as an important problem because even though we are surrounded by numbers, there is no effort on the part of academics, philosophy, thought in general, to pause and reflect on this entity called number. Is it simply a mechanical sense that we have? Is it something simply operational, or is it ontological? What number is? And he says this is particularly deplorable given that in the early part of the 20th century, what we know as now call as the modernist transformation of mathematics, in the early part of the 20th century, latter half of the 19th century, many thinkers like mathematicians such as Frege and Dedekind and Peano and Cantor and so on were writing about mathematics. They wrote extensively, writing about number. They wrote extensively about what a number is. And all their philosophical projects, and it won't be an exaggeration to say that their philosophical projects were based on the idea of the number. So Badiou is saying that it's very important to go back to those debates. to go back to those to that era, to excavate, to do an archaeological analysis of how these thinkers were thinking the number. Not because there is some golden key lying there, there is some hidden key through which you can unlock the sense of numericality, but what Badiou is saying, that if one goes back, then one will see the limitations and possibilities of those conceptions of number. And from there, one can start afresh to think the concept of the number anew. So it's not as if Badiou is saying that we must go back to the 19th century and the 20th century and to these old debates and seemingly arcane debates on numbers for the sake of it. He's saying that we will discover a minefield of possibilities as well as limitations that these conceptions of numbers had, and from there we can start afresh. We can start philosophizing on a new basis to think the number. And he says that resources for a new kind of thinking of number are present in contemporary mathematics in the theory of what are known as surreal numbers. But I will not go into that. At least for now. We'll go into that once we are at the latter half of the book. But for now, it is important to understand at least three things. One is that Badiou thinks that it is important to think the number. And this, he thinks, has both political and philosophical importance. One point. Secondly, he thinks that for that, we need to go back to the debates, to the older debates in the latter half of the 19th century, in the early part of the 20th century, on what a number is. And this includes a consideration of philosophies and mathematical theories by people such as Gottlob Frege, Dedekind, Cantor, Russell, and so on, and to see what are the limitations and possibilities of their project, so that one can start afresh. One can take what is important in those debates, what is the urgency that impelled them to think of the idea of number. We can learn something from that urgency, and we can start our thinking afresh on a new note. Second point. Third point is that he says that a new kind of thinking of number can be based upon mathematics itself, on a contemporary theory of number, which is a theory of surreal numbers. But this is dealt with in the latter half of the book, and I will not go into that for now. So this is what in effect Badiou is telling us in the first chapter, which is titled Number Must Be Thought. It's a very short chapter, and here the demands and the ambitions of the text are clearly laid out. So let's start with the second chapter, which is numbered 1, and it is titled Genealogies, Frege, Dedekind, Piano, Cantor. So this is the second chapter, numbered 1. Now this will involve some mathematics, and as I'm directly speaking from the text itself, so you will have to allow me a bit of stuttering here, because these are difficult ideas, but it's a very well written text, and it unfolds like sort of a suspense novel. So it's quite interesting to read. So Badiou begins by saying that the first thinking of number that we have is the Greek thinking of number. So the first thought of number, according to Badiou, is the Greek thought of number. And he says that the Greek thinkers of number related it back to the one, to the idea of the one. This idea of the one is present in Euclid's book, Elements. And what is this one? And Badiou says, and I quote, this is the first sentence of the second chapter. He says, from the supranumeric being of the one, unity is derived. And a number is a collection of units, an addition. Underlying this conception is a problematic that stretches from the Eleatics through to the Neoplatonists, that of the procession of the multiple from the one. Number is the schema of this procession, unquote. So he says that Greeks, they began with the idea of the one, the transcendent one, the idea of a sovereign God, so to speak. And he says the numerical one is derived from that transcendent one. And the general sense of the number is that of a procession. So procession of the multiple. So what is key to the idea of number? Key to the idea of number is that a number is a collection of units, an addition. So that is the important aspect of Greek thinking. But he says that with the modernization of mathematics, this Greek conception of number collapsed, or it became grossly insufficient. Why was it so? What happened with modern mathematics that this sense of the Greek conception of number collapsed? And he says there were three events. There were three events which took place because of which the older Greek thinking of number collapsed. The first of these events was the eruption of the problem of the infinite. Now, under the Greek thinking, what a number is? A number is a procession. So the key idea is collection of units, addition. But now with the modern conception of number, or in modernity what we have, with the modernization of mathematics what we have, is that the very idea of infinite emerges. And the idea of the infinite emerges not simply as the theological infinite, but a mathematical infinite. What is a mathematical infinite? People who do mathematics are aware of the idea of limits, that a series of numbers progresses towards or decreases towards a limit. And this limit, which the series never really touches the limit, but it is still assigned a number. Now the paradox is that if you have a processual sense of the number, that number is something that you can add and reach, then you have a paradox here, you have a contradiction here, because here what we are doing, we are assigning a number to a limit to which a series never actually reaches. So Badiou says, and I quote, "How can the limit of such a series be thought as number through the sole concept of a collection of units? A series tends towards a limit. It is not the addition of its terms or its units. It cannot be thought as a procession of the one." So with the emergence of the idea of the infinite, and it is both infinitesimally small and the idea of infinite, that the Greek thinking of number faced with this conception is faced with a problem. How to think number in this case? And one register through which Badiou problematizes the older Greek thinking is the register of limits. So we have often seen that a series progresses towards infinity, right? Or a series progresses towards zero, decreases towards zero, and so on and so forth. And Badiou says that a series never actually ends. It's a series of numbers. The series never actually touches the limit. Yet we assign a number to the limit. And he says, in what sense do we assign the number to the limit? If it's only processual, if it's only a collection of units, then how can we think a number in this case? So the first problem was that of the infinite. The second problem was the zero, a very important problem. As I have already said, as Badiou emphasizes, that the Greek began with the idea of the one. And with the modernist speculation on mathematics, what became more important than the one was the idea of the void, the empty set. So all set theory, all modern mathematics is premised on, or all set theory at least, is premised on the idea of the zero or the void. So the void cannot simply be related to the numerical one. Instead of the numerical one, instead of the transcendental one, what becomes more important is the zero or the void or the empty set. So again, for this as well, the Greek idea of number, which begins from the idea of the one, is grossly insufficient even to address it, even to face this challenge. And the third reason, and the most contemporary one, and this is Badiou's own specific terminology, so I'll read it from here and then I'll explain that, and I quote, this is on page number 8. The third reason and the most contemporary one is the pure and simple dislocation of the idea of a being of the one. We find ourselves under the jurisdiction of an epoch that obliges us to hold that being is essentially multiple. Consequently, number cannot proceed from the supposition of a transcendent being of the one. So instead of the one, what becomes important? Instead of the transcendent one or the numerical one, what becomes important is the multiple. And the multiple becomes, it exists prior to the one. So in set theory, for example, it is the multiple which is important. And Badiou says that since being is multiple, the one will not be able to account for this multiplicity. It is in fact only an element of this multiplicity. So with these three transformations, Badiou thinks, one is that the idea of the infinite, the eruption of the idea of the infinite, the eruption of the idea of infinite in the mathematical sense, posed a set of problems for philosophy, so that older accounts of number, which were premised on the idea of the one, became insufficient. The second was the challenge of the zero. That zero, empty set, null set, or the void became extremely important for the axiomatization of mathematics, what we call as modern mathematics. And if we begin from number one, then the problem becomes, how do we account for this primacy of the void? And the third reason, and Badiou thinks the most contemporary one, is that instead of the idea of unity, instead of the idea of the one, what becomes more important, and this is the lesson that modern mathematics teaches us, is the idea of the multiple. So he says that being is essentially multiple, and one is simply an element of this multiple. It is not a priori. It is not something from which we can begin with. So he says that with this crisis, we have a dissolution of the idea or the supremacy of the one. Now Badiou says there were three broad responses to this challenge. The challenge which was constituted by the eruption of the infinite, challenge of the zero, and the emergence of the multiple was responded by, the response came from philosophy and mathematics in three ways. The first was the approach which we associate with the names of Frege and Russell, and which is known as the logicist approach. And the logicist approach, now for all these approaches, very briefly let me state first, it became really important. See, you have zero, infinite, and the multiple, right? So it became really important for all these approaches to think the number now. There is no going forward for them. There was no going forward for them without thinking the idea of the number. So for all these approaches that we will discuss now, to think the number now became very important. It was a pressing urgency to think the multiple, to think number. What is it? So the modern crisis, the crisis necessitated by modernist transformations in mathematics, created a sort of urgency for these thinkers to respond to. So the first approach is that by Frege and Russell, which is known as the logicist approach. And the key aspect of the logicist approach was to extract the idea of number from laws of thought. So as Badiou says, summarizes it quite well, and this is page number 8 again, and I quote, he says, number, quote, number according to this point of view is a universal trait of the concept, deducible from absolutely original principles, principles without which thought in general would be impossible, unquote. So number here is deduced from principles of thought. So number becomes, the idea of number becomes subservient to thought itself. So for Frege and for Russell, if we get the logic of or laws of thought right, then we can deduce the concept of number from those laws. So number is that which responds to thought. Number is that which responds to the concept. This was the key aspect of the logicist program. The second program, associated with the names of the mathematicians Peano and Hilbert, and is known as the formalist approach. For them, numbers are simply arbitrary constructions which are governed by rule specific operations. So numbers become notational. These are just notations through which we operate. So they have a technical efficiency. Numbers are technically useful. Numbers are technically efficient. And these are arbitrary constructions whose rules of manipulation are specified by or specified through axiomatic rules. And that is what, so you have a clear-cut technicization of the idea of the number with Hilbert and Peano. So again, I quote Badiou, he says that, quote, we might say that here the concept of number is entirely mathematized, in the sense that it is conceived as existing only in the course of its usage. The essence of number is calculation, unquote. So if with the first approach, it is thought which is important, Frege and Russell, and number is deduced from laws of thought, in the second approach associated with Hilbert and Peano, numbers in themselves are just notational. They have a technical efficiency. So what Badiou says, they become completely mathematized. They have a realm of, it's a realm of axioms and operations. They are useful, they are applicable, and that is what numbers are. So in a sense, it puts barricades that, you know, this is mathematics, that is philosophy, and philosophy cannot enter within these barricades. So it with this, number becomes, you have a purely calculative sense of what a number is. The third approach, and Badiou identifies with this approach because he takes forward the key contributions, the key aspects of this approach further, is the set theoretical approach. The set theoretical approach is associated with people like von Neumann, Gödel, and so on, Dedekind. And this is a very important approach because this is something on which Badiou bases his political project as well. Not only the philosophical understanding, and both are very closely tied together. So this is a set theoretical approach. Now, what is a set theoretical approach? Badiou says, and I'll put it in his own words. He says on the same page number 8, quote, the concept of number, according to the set theoretical approach, the concept of number is thus referred back to an ontology of the pure multiple, whose great ideas are the classical axioms of set theory. In this concept, being a number is a particular predicate. The decision to consider as such certain classes of sets, the ordinals or the cardinals or the elements of the continuum, etc., with certain distinctive properties. The essence of number is that it is a pure multiple endowed with certain properties relating to its internal order. Number is before being made available for calculation. Here we are dealing with an ontologization of number, unquote. So Here what happens, that number becomes a decision on being. If I'm understanding him correctly, what is number according to Badiou? According to the set theoretical approach, number is a decision on being. Number is the decision to call certain classes or sets of classes as numbers with a set of properties which are internally ordered. So number responds to being. Number is a decision on being. So before you calculate from numbers, before you manipulate numbers, numbers are already there. So number is. That's what Badiou emphasizes. So this is a very important conception. I know it might sound as extremely theoretical for now and extremely abstract for now, but it will become clearer. So for Badiou here, a number is a particular predicate of being. This is something which is very important. So what is of key significance for the set theoretical approach is the idea of the multiple, and number responds to that multiple, is a decision on that multiple, and that's why he says that here we are dealing with an ontologization of number. So to summarize what we have discussed so far, Badiou says that we begin with the Greek thinking of number. With the Greek thinking of number, we encounter a major problem, so that the entire tradition of Greek thinking of number dissolves. And these problems, he says, are in fact three events. The event of the infinite, emergence of the infinite, emergence of the importance of zero or void or the empty set, and thirdly the dissolution of the idea of one and the emergence of the idea of the multiple as the core concept in modern mathematics. Now, to this crisis, various mathematicians and philosophers responded with a pressing urgency, because now it became very important for them to think what a number is, what a multiple is. These three approaches he divides into three parts. The first is the logicist perspective, which is that by Frege and Russell, where the idea of the number is subordinated to thought. So one must think the thought itself and then to deduce number from thought. The second is the axiomatic or operational approach, or the formalist approach associated with Hilbert and Peano, where we get in Badiou's terms the ideological socialization of number, because what we have is there is no thinking of number as such, or the thinking of number as such is circumscribed, and what we get is a completely technical project. So numbers are constructions controlled by axioms, and they are technically effective. This is the second sense. The third is the set theoretical thesis, which Badiou thinks is the most important and goes most further as far as thinking the idea of number is concerned. But he says that this approach, its true radical consequences haven't been drawn so far. We have a very important potential in these in the set theoretical approach, and that is what Badiou takes up in detail in the second half of the text. So these are the three approaches: the logicist, the formalist, and the set theoretical approach, where a number becomes a decision on being. It is. So it becomes, the ontology of number becomes important. So he says this is very important to now. He says this was the project. This is what is we are given with. So this is the thinking of number that we already have. But he says after that, after the set theoretical program in its philosophical momentum, it ended. After that, the thinking of number, so to speak, completely stopped. Yes, number theory developed, numbers developed, all kinds of ways of calculating developed, and we came to be surrounded by numbers. But number of thinking, the thinking of what a number is, became a redundant project, became an obsolete project after this. And he thinks this is a huge problem. Because even in mathematics, leave aside numbers that we are surrounded by, even in mathematics, he says there are whole numbers, rational numbers, real numbers, ordinary manipulations, all kinds of numbers you have, even in mathematics. And we call all these, uh, whether they are ordinary numbers, natural numbers, whole numbers, real numbers, quaternions, complex numbers, whole or rational numbers, irrational numbers, we call all of them as numbers. Yet we don't have a specification of what a number is. So he says that this is in fact directly related to the problem within mathematics is related to the problem that we encountered in the world also. That in our lives we are ruled by numbers of all kinds, numbers of um, all ways of calculating, all ways of ordering our lives, all ways of subjecting ourselves and others to account, yet we don't know what a number is. And in mathematics also, all we have different kinds of ways of understanding number, different kinds of ways in which the idea of number is understood, yet you don't have a precise, settled sense of what a number is. And Badiou uh, is trying to firstly pinpoint this as a problem. He says, so just to give some examples. So he says, not only are the numbers different, you have natural numbers and negative numbers, but procedures of calculation, procedures of arriving at them are also different. For example, natural numbers can be arrived by an axiomatic system like that of Peano. To engender negative numbers from natural numbers, you need algebraic manipulations. You need further manipulations related to multiplication to obtain rational numbers, and so on. There are, if you can keep on going. So he says that there are so many procedures. Cardinals are different from ordinals, and not only just different, but radically different. So he says there are different kinds of numbers, different ways in which number is understood, and the procedures of arriving at these numbers are also very different. So he says that we don't really have a proper thinking of number. We don't really have a proper sense of what a number is, even though we are surrounded by so many types of numbers. And he says if you look at even the early thinking on number, if you look at, say, for example, Frege and Dedekind, even between them, you have the kind of differences that they have are very revealing. For Dedekind, when he thought about number, he thought that one must begin from the idea of the infinite, and then one must derive the idea of the finite from the infinite. Whereas Frege begins with the finite and goes to the infinite after that. So there are very important divergences between these early attempts as well. So you can see that there is some problem. You can see that there is some stuttering. You can see that there is some urgency to articulate what a number is, and yet there is no common ground. And Badiou thinks that we need a common ground. We need a common ground because not only is this mathematically important, not only is this philosophically important, but it's politically important as well. Because problems within mathematics are not really different from problems outside of it, problems that we encounter in the world. So if we really need to arrest this domination of numbers, we firstly need to think what a number is. We must think what these multiplicities, what these numericalities are. Otherwise, we will simply be manipulated by these. And he thinks that it's if you go back to the older debates, there are rich resources in those debates to resurrect a new kind of thinking of number. And that new kind of thinking of number can be based upon a very important mathematical theory of numbers, which is a recent theory of numbers. I will not go into that, but that is the theory of surreal numbers. I will not go into that in this discussion, but it's a very important contemporary theory, and Badiou says one can base a new philosophy, a new understanding of what numbers are onto this mathematically significant understanding of numbers. But before that, what Badiou does now in subsequent chapters, I have given a very brief and general overview of what he is doing. Now he will go into the details of what Frege's philosophy is about, what Dedekind's understanding of numbers was, what Cantor's understanding of numbers was, and after doing an extensive review and a very sharp review of all these philosophies and mathematical approaches to the idea of number, in the latter part of the book, or in the second part of the book more precisely, he will present his own understanding, drawing from the set theoretical approach, drawing from the theory of surreal numbers to articulate a new mathematico-philosophical understanding of what a number is. So it is both philosophically, mathematically, and politically important for us to think what a number is. The thinking of number, which began with the Greeks, began with the idea of the one. It encountered serious problems with the emergence of the idea of the infinite, of the zero, and of the multiple, because of which it necessitated a new kind of thinking. These new directions were the logicist approach, Frege and Russell, then the formalist approach, Peano, Hilbert, and then the set theoretical approach. All these approaches had great potentials, but after that this philosophical project was not really followed, because what resulted with the development of mathematics was an ideological socialization of numbers, that mathematics itself drew around itself a boundary, that what is mathematically legitimate about mathematics only mathematics can tell. Philosophy has no business about it. So you don't really have a thinking of number because of that, and which has taken us to our present condition, where we don't really have a sense of what numbers are. Politically, it is significant, Badiou thinks, because from the academia to the markets, to the everyday life, to politics, to the to such confrontations on the very idea of the citizenship, of the idea of controlling population, or the very sense of population depends on number, and yet we cannot really contest it, we cannot really understand it, we cannot really encounter it if we don't have a precise sense of what a number is. So this is what Badiou's project is. In the next discussion, in the next video, I hope I'll be speaking about Frege's approach in greater detail. It's a very important text which is titled Foundations of Arithmetic, which Badiou speaks about. So I'll be speaking about a text in the next video. Thank you.